Have you ever felt like the definitions of the most basic words are just suddenly shifting under your feet?
Oh man, all the time.
Right? Like you woke up one morning and the institutions once trusted implicitly, your schools, the courts, the medical establishment, were suddenly operating on this completely alien set of rules.
Speaking a language you don't even fully recognize anymore.
Exactly. It's like trying to navigate reality without a map. And that is exactly what we are tackling today. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are thrilled to have you with us.
We really are.
And hey, if you appreciate the forensic, in-depth analysis we do here, please take a second right now to hit that like button and subscribe to the feed. We rely entirely on you to keep this going.
Absolutely.
Today, we are reviewing a highly provocative, deeply controversial new ebook that attempts to provide that exact map we were just talking about. It's called Trivium of God: Deconstructing Marxist Lies for Spiritual Warriors by Conrad Riker.
It's quite a title.
It is. We definitely encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy a copy if you want to follow along with us. And you can also find the author on Substack at the handle @Conrad Riker.
So to set the table properly here, we really need to be very precise about the nature of this text. Conrad Riker is writing for a highly specific demographic.
Right. This isn't just for a general audience.
No, not at all. This book is explicitly tailored for the manosphere, specifically the men's rights activist community and audiences that, identify with the Red Pill movement.
Okay.
He is speaking directly to men who feel totally disenfranchised by the modern cultural landscape.
Which brings me to a really crucial neutrality disclaimer before we go a single step further into this deep dive. The mission today is to unpack Riker's incredibly complex historical and philosophical framework.
And it is complex.
Very. He lays out this meticulous timeline arguing how Western institutions were, in his explicit view, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. So we are going to be exploring some highly charged, controversial arguments today.
Yeah, we're getting into the weeds.
But our goal today is not to endorse Riker's worldview,
Right.
nor is it to condemn it or debunk it, right?
Right.
We are acting as forensic investigators.
We want you, the listener, to understand the architecture of his argument.
Exactly. We want you to see the historical pivots he identifies and the logic of his framework completely, regardless of your personal political stance.
That is really the only way to truly understand a text like this. You just have to step inside the author's epistemological framework and see the world through their specific lens for a minute.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So let's start right at the front door, the title, Trivium of God. Now, I am familiar with the trivium as an educational concept from antiquity, but Riker's using it as something entirely different.
It really is.
How does an ancient educational model become the foundation for a modern manifesto?
Well, the historical trivium is basically the bedrock of classical education. It originated in ancient Greece and Rome, and then it was heavily formalized in the Middle Ages.
Okay, so it's ancient.
Right. And it consists of 3 sequential stages of learning: grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Grammar, logic, rhetoric.
Got it. The philosophy back then was that before you can debate an idea, you first have to understand the mechanics of language. That's grammar.
Makes sense.
Then you have to understand how to combine those mechanics into valid reasoning. That's logic.
Right.
And only then can you persuasively communicate that reasoning to others, which is rhetoric.
It's a step-by-step process.
Exactly. But Riker takes this classical pedagogical tool and he essentially weaponizes it. He repurposes the trivium as a tactical combat system.
A combat system, wow.
Yeah. His core premise is that modern men have been systematically and intentionally intellectually disarmed because the public education system just stopped teaching these 3 foundational skills.
So he structures his entire framework around reclaiming those 3 pillars. Let's dive into step 1, grammar. But when Riker talks about grammar, he's clearly not talking about dangling modifiers or where to put a semicolon.
No, definitely not.
He frames this as the lexical battlefield.
Yes, for Riker, grammar is metaphysical.
Metaphysical, how so?
He argues that words are metaphysical containers that hold human understanding. Therefore, the culture war we are experiencing right now isn't primarily a political battle. It is a battle over vocabulary.
Oh, wow. So whoever controls the words.
Controls the narrative, exactly. His argument is that if an ideology can conquer the dictionary, it conquers the limits of human thought. If you lose control of the definitions, you lose control of reality itself.
And he doesn't just treat this as some modern internet phenomenon either. He traces this strategy back to a very specific historical figure, the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci.
Gramsci is essential to Riker's entire thesis.
Walk me through this. How does a guy writing in the 1930s connect to today's lexical battlefield?
Okay, so Antonio Gramsci was a Marxist intellectual who was imprisoned by Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy.
Right, Mussolini threw him in jail.
Yes, and between 1929 and 1935, while sitting in this prison cell, he wrote what became known as his prison notebooks. Gramsci was wrestling with a massive failure in Marxist theory.
What was the failure?
Well, Karl Marx had prophesied that the working class in capitalist, industrialized Western nations would inevitably rise up in a violent economic revolution and seize the factories.
Right, workers of the world unite, all that.
Exactly. But Gramsci looked around and saw that this simply wasn't happening in the West.
Why not?
Because the working class in the West had completely different allegiances.
Oh, interesting. Allegiances to what?
Gramsci realized that the Western worker wasn't just an economic unit. The worker went to church on Sunday. The worker was fiercely loyal to his nation, to his local community, and above all, to his family.
So those institutions kind of buffered them against revolution.
Right. These institutions provided meaning and stability. So Gramsci theorized this concept of cultural hegemony. He argued that the ruling class doesn't just maintain power through economic dominance or police force. They maintain it through cultural consensus.
Cultural consensus,
Right.
meaning the culture just agrees on the rules.
Exactly. The church, the schools, the family, these institutions create a hegemony, a set of invisible societal norms that make the existing order feel natural, moral, and inevitable.
Meaning a violent factory revolt would always fail because the culture itself would reject it as immoral.
Precisely. Therefore, Gramsci concluded that for Marxism to succeed in the West, it had to stop focusing entirely on economics and start conquering the cultural institutions.
The long march through the institution.
Yes, Marxists had to capture the universities, the media, the entertainment industry, and the language itself, slowly shifting that cultural hegemony until Marxist ideas felt like the natural moral consensus.
And Riker claims that this slow, deliberate capture of the cultural hegemony began by weaponizing language. He gives some incredibly stark examples of how he believes words have been entirely emptied of their historical meaning and refilled with, like, ideological acid.
Yeah, he uses some strong imagery.
The primary example he uses is the word patriarchy.
According to Riker's historical analysis, the word patriarchy traditionally described a very natural, practical system of social organization based on provision and protection.
Okay, so it wasn't originally a negative term in his view.
Right. In historical patriarchal systems, male authority was inextricably linked to liability.
Liability, like responsibility.
Extreme responsibility. If you were the head of the household, you held the power, yes, but you also carried the absolute legal and physical burden of survival for everyone under your roof.
But he argues the modern left executed a lexical shift here. They redefined patriarchy from a system of survival into this malicious, oppressive conspiracy designed specifically to subjugate women.
And Riker uses formal logic to dissect how this redefinition functions in the modern world. He labels the contemporary use of the word patriarchy as an example of petitio principii,
Which is,
the logical fallacy of begging the question.
okay, begging the question, meaning the premise assumes the truth of the conclusion it's trying to prove.
Exactly. Riker points out that modern intersectional sociology assumes that a systemic, malicious oppression of women exists, and then uses everything that happens to prove that it exists.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It becomes a perfectly circular, closed-loop argument. If a man achieves incredible success, the sociologists claim it's the result of the patriarchy elevating him.
And if he fails,
If a man falls into despair and homelessness, they claim it's the patriarchy backfiring on him. Riker argues the word has been deliberately detached from any objective, measurable reality. It has been transformed into a universal, unfalsifiable container for blame.
okay, let's unpack this, because the way he describes this linguistic capture feels very mechanical. It reminds me of a malicious software update.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Imagine you're running a massive, complex operating system, let's call it Western civilization.
Okay, tracking with you.
While the program is humming along, a hacker sneaks in and subtly alters the core coding language on the server side. Suddenly, the basic commands mean something entirely different.
The code is corrupted.
Yeah. The average user is sitting at their terminal, typing in commands that used to work, but now they're just getting error messages, or the system is executing destructive actions.
And they don't know why.
Exactly. The users don't have admin rights. They can't change the dictionary back. So the system just fundamentally crashes because it can't process reality anymore.
That is a perfect encapsulation of Riker's view. And the list of hacked code goes far beyond just the word patriarchy.
What other words does he point to?
Riker traces how the word violence historically meant the application of physical force causing bodily harm. But he says it has been expanded to include subjective emotional distress or even silence.
Silence is violence.
Exactly. The word toxic migrated from describing measurable biological poisons to describing traditional stoic male behaviors.
Toxic masculinity.
Right. The word equity used to mean equal treatment under an objective law. Now, he argues, it has been redefined to mean state-mandated forced equality of outcome, regardless of effort.
So if the dictionary has been hacked, and the average person doesn't have the admin rights to fix it, what is Riker's tactical advice? How are you supposed to communicate when the dictionary keeps changing? How do you fight a lexical war?
His counter tactic is what he calls reclaiming the sword of definition. He instructs his readers to adopt a posture of absolute refusal.
Refusal of what?
He says you must refuse the adversary's linguistic framework entirely. When someone confronts you with a term like toxic masculinity or verbal violence, Riker commands his readers to halt the conversation and demand a strict, rigorous definition.
But you don't just accept their premise.
Never. You force the adversary to define their terms precisely. You make them articulate the exact distinction between physical harm and emotional offense.
That's a very aggressive stance.
It is. Riker argues that modern ideological arguments rely entirely on ambiguity and emotional manipulation. By dragging the adversary into the harsh, uncompromising light of strict grammar, their arguments just dissolve.
You force them to show their work. That transitions us beautifully into the second pillar of the Trivium. Because if grammar is how you define reality, logic is how you structure it. Riker titles this section, The Logic of the Logos versus the Demons of Dialectics.
Yes.
Let's start with the logos. What exactly does he mean by that?
To really grasp Riker's framework here, you have to understand the profound historical weight of the concept of the logos. In classical Greek philosophy and later integrated deeply into Christian theology, the logos is the rational, ordering principle of the universe.
Okay, so it's like the underlying code of existence.
Right. It is the divine logic that governs all things. It posits that the universe is not random chaos. It has a fundamental, intelligible, and knowable structure.
And the absolute bedrock of that structure, according to Riker, is Aristotle's law of non-contradiction.
Yes. The law of non-contradiction states that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect.
A is A.
A is A. It is the most foundational rule of human reason. You cannot have a square circle. But Riker argues that the modern iteration of cultural Marxism actively and intentionally wars against the logos. He claims that modern ideology demands that we accept blatant, aggressive contradictions as moral truths.
Give me an example of that.
He says it demands we believe that incurring massive debt is actually generating wealth, that physical weakness is a form of moral strength, or that a biological male is simultaneously a female.
Okay, and he introduces a historical parallel here that completely stopped me in my tracks when I read it.
The Salem comparison.
Yes. To illustrate how this anti-logic operates as an institutional weapon, he reaches back to the 1692 Salem witch trials. He draws a direct, one-to-one comparison between the judicial mechanisms of Salem and modern corporate HR departments.
It's one of his most striking historical syntheses.
Walk me through the spectral evidence parallel, because this is wild.
Right. So during the Salem witch trials, the magistrates faced a legal problem. Witchcraft is invisible. So they allowed the admission of spectral evidence. This was the belief that a witch could send her invisible spirit or specter to torment a victim. Because only the victim could see the specter, there was no objective physical evidence required.
Which creates a perfect epistemological trap.
Exactly. If you were accused in Salem, the structure of the logic made innocence impossible.
Absolutely.
If you broke down and confessed to being a witch, the court found you guilty. But if you maintained your innocence and vehemently denied being a witch, the magistrates concluded that your denial was simply proof that the demonic spirit was deceiving you and hardening your heart.
Wow. So you were damned if you confessed and damned if you denied it.
Precisely. And Riker connects this directly to modern concepts like implicit bias and systemic racism.
Okay, explain that connection.
Well, he invokes the philosopher Karl Popper, who established the principle of falsifiability. Popper argued that for a theory to be scientifically or logically valid, it must be capable of being proven false.
Right, you have to be able to test it.
Yes. Riker points out that concepts like implicit bias are mathematically unfalsifiable claims.
Unfalsifiable, so you can't disprove them.
Right. If you go to a corporate diversity training and confess to having implicit bias, you are guilty.
And if you deny it.
If you look at the trainer and deny having implicit bias, the trainer will tell you that your denial is the definitive textbook proof of your implicit bias.
Because it's implicit.
Exactly. Riker argues this is the exact same epistemological model as the witch trials. It is not designed to uncover empirical facts. It is designed to extract forced compliance through psychological terror and shame. You are fighting phantoms.
That is a truly terrifying way to view institutional protocols. So if logic has been untethered from falsifiable reality, how does Riker apply this to, like, material economic debates? Because the book dedicates a massive amount of ink to dismantling the feminist narrative of the wage gap.
Yeah, he spends a lot of time on economics. He applies his logical framework by completely rejecting the foundational premise of the wage gap. He forces the reader to look at the other side of the statistical ledger.
What's on the other side?
When confronted with the assertion that women earn less than men across the aggregate economy due to systemic discrimination, Riker instructs his readers to pivot immediately to an empirical reality he terms the death gap.
The death gap. Explain the mechanics of that.
Riker pulls the occupational fatality statistics, pointing out that men make up the vast, overwhelming majority of workplace deaths, routinely over 90%.
90%. That's massive.
He forces the reader to look at where the wealth at the top of the economic pyramid is actually generated. It is generated by men working brutal, physically destructive, and highly lethal jobs.
Right.
It is the men doing the roofing in 110-degree heat, the deep-sea fishing in freezing storms, the logging, the underground mining, the high-voltage electrical line repair.
It's the physical toll of civilization building.
Precisely. Riker argues that the modern egalitarian left looks at the aggregate wealth generated by these incredibly dangerous, body-destroying professions and demands an equal 50-50 financial outcome at the top.
But without demanding what?
Without ever demanding a 50-50 equal participation in the fatal risks at the bottom.
And this leads to his redefinition of traditional masculinity. If patriarchy isn't an oppressive conspiracy like we talked about earlier, how does he frame the historical male role?
He frames it as an act of supreme, self-sacrificial love.
Love. That's not a word you usually hear in these debates.
Right, but he argues that traditional masculinity is inherently designed to absorb the harshness, the brutality, and the lethal danger of the physical world so that women and children are protected from it. He argues the hierarchy isn't built on hatred of women. It's built on the male biological imperative to act as a shield.
What's fascinating here is how he connects this to the psychological engine driving the culture war. If traditional structures were built on provision and protection, why is there such a fierce, organized effort to tear them down?
He traces this to the concept of envy, but he goes deep into the Latin etymology to explain how envy actually operates.
Right, he makes a big distinction between envy and jealousy.
Yes, a critical distinction. Jealousy is wanting something someone else has. You see a man with a beautiful house, and you want a beautiful house too.
Which is normal.
Right, that can actually be a motivating force. But envy is much darker. He traces the word to the Latin root invidia, which literally translates to look against in a hostile manner.
To look upon with an evil eye.
Exactly. Envy isn't a desire to attain what the successful person has. It is a malicious, destructive urge to ensure the successful person loses it.
Oh, wow.
Riker argues that the entire philosophical edifice of modern egalitarianism is driven not by a noble compassion for the weak, but by this hostile invidia against the competent.
He uses the crab bucket analogy here, right?
He does, and he expands on it deeply. If you put a single crab in a bucket, it can easily climb out. But if you put a dozen crabs in a bucket, none of them will ever escape.
Why?
Because the moment one crab figures out the climb and reaches the rim, the other crabs don't study his technique. They don't ask him to reach down and pull them up. Instead, they reach up with their claws and violently drag the achieving crab back down into the muck to boil with them.
That is a brutal visual.
It is. And Riker posits that this is the exact sociological mechanism of radical feminism and critical theory. They do not want to build excellence. They want to punitively seize and destroy earned merit because the existence of merit highlights their own inadequacies.
So, we have the corruption of grammar, the shifting dictionary, we have the corruption of logic, the unfalsifiable witch trials, and the envy-driven destruction of merit.
We're moving through the trivium.
Right. And this moves us from the abstract realm of philosophy into the brutal reality of how this manifests in our daily lives. How do these corrupted concepts become codified into law? Riker identifies this epoch as the therapeutic tyranny. What does that mean?
Riker argues that the traditional Western legal and civic paradigm was built on the objective, blind rule of law. Lady Justice is blindfolded because she is not supposed to care about your identity, your class, or your emotional state. She only cares about the empirical evidence.
Just the facts.
Right. Riker codes this objective, dispassionate system as fundamentally masculine. But he argues that over the last century, this has been overthrown and replaced by the therapeutic tyranny.
The therapeutic tyranny.
Yes. This is a paradigm where objective evidence is entirely subordinated to psychology, subjective feelings, and emotional comfort, which he labels as a female-coded system of governance.
Meaning under a therapeutic tyranny, the most important metric isn't what objectively happened, but how did the event make the alleged victim feel?
Exactly. Emotional distress becomes the highest legal tender.
And he points to the American university system as the primary laboratory where this legal inversion was tested. Specifically, he spends a lot of time analyzing the 2011 Dear Colleague letter issued by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights regarding Title IX.
This is a crucial piece of Riker's timeline.
I want to spend some time on this because it's a specific historical inflection point in his framework.
Okay, so Title IX was originally passed in 1972 to ensure equal funding in educational programs. It's mostly famously known for equalizing women's college sports.
Right. Everyone knows Title IX for sports.
But Riker argues that the 2011 Dear Colleague letter weaponized Title IX beyond recognition. The directive essentially ordered universities to change how they handled allegations of sexual misconduct on campus.
By changing the burden of proof, right?
Right. It mandated that universities lower the standard of evidence from the traditional clear and convincing standard down to a mere preponderance of the evidence.
Preponderance of the evidence. What does that mean in legal terms?
In legal terms, preponderance of the evidence just means 51% certainty. It's more likely than not.
Wow, just 51%.
Yeah. Riker argues that by lowering the evidentiary standard to a coin flip, and by frequently denying the accused male the right to cross-examine his accuser or even see the evidence against him, the federal government strong-armed universities into creating gynocentric star chambers.
He links this administrative shift directly to the cultural rallying cry of the Me Too movement, which was listen and believe.
Riker views the phrase listen and believe as the ultimate epistemological collapse of Western jurisprudence.
That's a heavy claim. Why?
He categorizes it as the logical fallacy of ad verecundiam, which is an appeal to unqualified authority. In this case, the unqualified authority is the lived experience of the accuser.
So the accusation itself becomes the proof.
Exactly. By demanding that society automatically believe an accusation based solely on the gender of the accuser and their emotional distress, Riker argues we have abandoned the Enlightenment and regressed to pre-Roman tribal mob justice.
But as intense as his critique of the university system is, it pales in comparison to his analysis of the family court system. This part of the book is visceral.
Oh, it really is.
He argues that the family courts are the primary enforcement arm of the therapeutic tyranny, and he traces the legal destruction of the family all the way back to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention.
This goes back to our earlier discussion about the historical link between male authority and male liability.
Right, the traditional patriarchal contract.
Riker argues that the original patriarchal marriage contract was a deeply serious, sacred social architecture. Under common law doctrines, yes, the husband had final authority over the household's direction and finances. But in exchange for that authority, he bore absolute crushing liability.
So if things went wrong,
If the family farm failed, or if the wife ran up massive debts, the state didn't come for the wife. The husband was the one dragged to debtor's prison. He absorbed the civilizational risk.
but Riker claims that modern family law, fueled by the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s, completely inverted this contract.
He argues it created a worst of both worlds scenario for men. He claims that family courts today routinely strip men of their authority in the home, often through default maternal custody judgments in no-fault divorces, but they ruthlessly maintain and enforce the traditional male financial liability.
Through alimony and child support.
Right. He uses a highly evocative phrase here, stating that family courts reduce fathers from leaders to disposable ATMs.
And he backs this up with some very specific, granular legal citations. He points to the Bradley Amendment, which I had honestly never heard of before reading this source.
Most people haven't. The Bradley Amendment is codified in Title 42, Provision 666 of the United States Code.
Provision 666. You can't make that up.
Yeah, passed in 1986. It mandates that child support obligations become absolute judgments by operation of law. What this means practically, and what Riker focuses on, is that child support arrears cannot be retroactively modified by a judge, even if the circumstances are catastrophic.
Wait, so if a man loses his job, or worse,
Riker gives this extreme but legally accurate example. If a man is suddenly paralyzed in a horrific car accident and cannot work, or if he is unjustly thrown in prison, the financial debt continues to compound every single month.
a judge can't stop it.
A judge has no legal authority to forgive the back debt once the man proves his incapacity. Riker views this provision as the creation of a literal state-sponsored debtor's prison.
That is intense.
He argues it proves the system doesn't view men as human beings requiring empathy, but purely as financial extraction units designed to fund a matriarchal collective.
Let me stop right there and ask a foundational question. So what does this all mean? If the legal system is truly this hostile, this systematically weaponized against men and fathers, what is the ultimate ideological endgame? Why target the family unit so aggressively?
Riker points directly to the Marxist imperative to destroy the nuclear family. He argues that a strong, self-sufficient family unit is the primary obstacle to total state control.
Okay, so the state wants to eliminate its competition.
Exactly. He references the famous 1965 Moynihan Report, written by sociologist Daniel Patrick Moynihan. The report warned that the expansion of the welfare state, specifically programs that subsidize single motherhood by penalizing households with a father present, would lead to the total collapse of the black family structure in America.
Moynihan was trying to sound the alarm.
He was. But Riker argues that the architects of the Cultural Revolution looked at the devastation Moynihan described and viewed it not as a tragedy, but as a highly successful blueprint.
Oh, blueprint.
Yes, he argues they took that blueprint and applied it to the entire culture. According to Riker's framework, the ultimate goal of cultural Marxism is to systematically destroy the traditional patriarch, the father, who provides and protects, and replace him with the ultimate false father, the totalitarian welfare state.
Because if you destroy the father, you make the wife and the children entirely dependent on the government for their survival.
It's the privatization of the family's assets and the socialization of its dependency.
That is a chilling thesis. But Riker argues that the assault doesn't stop at the legal boundaries of the family. He claims that the final frontier of this ideological war is an assault on human biology itself. This brings us to Section 4, the transhumanist endgame and the assault on natural law.
Riker views gender ideology as the absolute zenith of the left's war against objective reality.
The zenith. How so?
He argues that it is not merely a niche civil rights issue about accommodating a marginalized group. It is a fundamental stress test of the population's psychological subjugation.
A stress test.
His logic is this. Human biological dimorphism, male and female, is the most obvious, fundamental, and universally observable binary in the natural world. If an institution can force you, under threat of losing your job or your social standing, to verbally deny that fundamental reality, they have completely broken your tether to objective truth.
You become completely malleable.
Precisely.
And he doesn't just rely on philosophical arguments here. He brings heavy empirical receipts to back up his claim that the institutions have failed. He cites the Cass Review at length.
The Cass Review is a huge part of this section.
Right. For our listeners who might not be steeped in the medical policy debates, the Cass Review was an exhaustive, 400-page independent report commissioned by England's National Health Service, released in April 2024.
Very recent.
Yeah. It was led by Dr. Hilary Cass, a highly respected pediatrician, to examine the state of pediatric gender identity services.
And the findings of the Cass Review were earth-shattering for the medical establishment.
What did it conclude?
It essentially concluded that the medical evidence supporting the puberty blockade and cross-sex hormone transition of minors was remarkably weak, built on poor quality studies, and that the clinical guidelines had been driven more by ideological consensus than by rigorous scientific evidence.
So Riker weaponizes this report.
He absolutely does. He uses it to validate his overarching thesis, that affirming subjective identity over immutable biological reality is a massive, systemic, and historically catastrophic institutional failure.
This raises an important question, though. If the science is this rank, and the potential harm to children is this severe, why would massive legacy medical institutions push it so aggressively?
Riker delves into what he calls the deeper game theory, and it ties back to his ideas about transhumanism.
Transhumanism. Explain that in this context.
Transhumanism is the philosophical belief that the human race can evolve beyond its current physical and mental limitations, usually through the integration of technology and extreme medical intervention.
Okay.
Riker argues that the driving force behind institutional gender ideology isn't actually compassion or empathy for confused adolescents. It is a transhumanist endgame.
How does that connect to gender ideology?
He argues that the semantic trick of claiming biology is merely assigned at birth by a doctor, rather than being an immutable blueprint encoded in the DNA of every single cell in your body, is an incredibly dangerous precedent.
Right, because if it's assigned, it can be unassigned.
Exactly. If human nature and human biology are arbitrary and negotiable, then humans can be engineered. Riker warns that this ideology allows the state, in partnership with massive, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies, to step in and mold, medicate, and endlessly monetize human beings.
Endlessly monetized.
Yes. He uses a very dark phrase, warning that humanity is being reduced to programmable meat.
Programmable meat. That's horrifying. But it's important to note that Riker doesn't direct his anger at the individuals suffering from gender dysphoria.
No, he doesn't.
He actually uses a classical rhetorical tool here called the distingue, the drawing of precise distinctions.
Yes, the distinguo is crucial here because it prevents his argument from coming across as merely callous. Riker completely concedes the emotional reality of the patients.
He acknowledges their pain.
He acknowledges that gender dysphoric children are suffering from genuine, profound despair. He notes the high comorbidities with trauma, autism spectrum disorders, and severe anxiety. He recognizes their pain is real. However, he absolutely and categorically refuses the proposed cure of medical transition.
He uses an incredibly brutal analogy to explain why he rejects the cure. He compares gender-affirming care to treating a patient suffering from severe anorexia.
This is a really powerful analogy in the book.
If an anorexic patient looks in the mirror and genuinely, desperately believes they are morbidly obese despite being dangerously underweight, a compassionate doctor doesn't validate that delusion.
Right. Riker points out that you don't treat the anorexic patient by handing them a scalpel and offering them a surgical gastric bypass because they feel fat.
That would be malpractice.
Exactly. You recognize that the physical body is healthy and the mind is disordered. You treat the mind. Riker argues that surgical or chemical transition is the equivalent of performing the gastric bypass. You are surgically mutilating a perfectly healthy, functioning physical body to appease a disordered psychological state.
For Riker, true compassion is speaking the uncompromising biological truth, even when the patient finds that truth painful.
That's his stance.
So we have traced Riker's framework through the corruption of language, the inversion of logic in the courts, the destruction of the family contract, and the denial of fundamental human biology.
It's a comprehensive theory of institutional collapse.
It is, which leads us to ask, how did this anti-reality virus infect the corporate boardroom and the engineering firm? How did it capture the centers of capital and production? That brings us to Section 5, the war on competence and the DEI death cult.
Riker operates on the premise that meritocracy is the natural outpouring of natural law.
Meaning,
In a sane, functioning universe governed by the logos, the strong, the highly intelligent, and the most capable individuals naturally rise to the top of hierarchies to build and maintain civilization.
right.
Therefore, Riker views the modern corporate shift toward DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, not as a benign HR initiative, but as a literal, intentional war on competence.
And just like he did with Title IX in the family courts, he anchors this corporate capture in a specific piece of legal history. The 1971 Supreme Court decision in Griggs v. Duke Power Co.
This is a foundational case for his economic argument.
Walk us through why he views this specific case as the moment American competence began to die.
Griggs v. Duke Power is the hinge point. Duke Power Company had instituted a policy where employees needed a high school diploma and had to pass a standardized cognitive aptitude test to transfer into higher paying departments.
Okay, sounds like a standard competency test.
The tests were completely neutral on their face. However, the Supreme Court found that because African American employees failed the tests at a disproportionately higher rate than white employees, the tests violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, even if the company had no discriminatory intent.
Because of the outcome.
Exactly. This decision birthed the legal doctrine of disparate impact. Riker argues that Griggs was the moment the therapeutic tyranny conquered the private sector.
How so?
It meant that objective, mathematically neutral competency tests were suddenly illegal if they did not magically produce perfectly equal demographic outcomes. Riker argues this effectively codified theft.
A codified theft.
Yes. It forced companies to abandon objective standards of excellence and merit and instead implement hiring practices designed to achieve statistical equity.
But Griggs was in 1971. How did we get from a Supreme Court ruling on aptitude tests to the modern era where every Fortune 500 company seems absolutely obsessed with aggressive DEI mandates?
Riker points the finger at the centralization of capital, specifically targeting Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock.
Ah, BlackRock.
BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager, controlling trillions of dollars in investments. Riker zeroes in on Larry Fink's famous 2018 annual letter to CEOs.
What did the letter say?
Fink essentially stated that BlackRock would begin holding companies accountable not just for financial performance, but for their positive contribution to society, heavily leaning into ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and DEI metrics.
So if a company didn't comply,
Riker claims Fink used his unimaginable financial leverage to force corporate America to adopt cultural Marxism. Essentially, it was a mafia tactic. If a corporation didn't play along and implement the DEI agenda, BlackRock would starve them of investment capital.
so wasn't organic.
Not according to Riker. He views this as the ultimate top-down coercive enforcement of anti-logos ideology.
And he tracked how this systemic rejection of merit has simultaneously destroyed the educational system. He contrasts what he calls the ancient mastery ladder with the modern system of standardized credentialism.
This is a great point he makes. Historically, for thousands of years, men learned a trade through the mastery ladder, which was the apprenticeship system.
Right.
A young man didn't sit in a lecture hall. He apprenticed under a master craftsman. He proved his value and his intelligence through actual, tangible physical labor over years.
You couldn't fake it.
You couldn't fake competence on the mastery ladder. If you couldn't lay a brick or forge a tool, you didn't advance.
But Riker claims this organic system of transferring knowledge was deliberately dismantled by the state. He points to federal interventions like the 1917 Smith-Hughes Act.
Right, the Smith-Hughes Act provided federal funding for vocational education, but in doing so, it centralized it. Riker argues that this was the beginning of pulling young men out of the localized, practical workshops and forcing them into standardized, state-controlled classrooms.
It separated the acquisition of knowledge from the physical reality of the work.
Exactly.
And the ultimate evolution of that centralization is modern standardized credentialism. Riker holds a deep, abiding contempt for the modern university degree.
He really does. Outside of the hard STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, he views the modern college diploma not as proof of any actual worldly capability, but as a participation trophy.
Worse than a participation trophy, he views it as an ideological receipt.
An ideological receipt, yes.
He argues that a liberal arts degree today simply proves to a corporate HR department that a young person is docile and compliant enough to sit in a classroom for 4 years, absorb anti-Western ideological programming, and regurgitate it without rebelling.
It is a gatekeeping mechanism designed to filter out anyone who actually thinks independently or questions the ruling hegemony.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to highlight an analogy Riker uses here,
Yeah.
because it brings the abstract threat of DEI into terrifying, concrete focus. He uses the analogy of a structural engineer building a bridge.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
If you're building a suspension bridge, gravity is not a social construct.
Why?
Gravity is not an oppressor. Gravity does not care one bit about your trauma, your lived experience, or your identity.
Well, it doesn't.
The steel cables hold a specific, mathematically undeniable tensile strength. Steel does not respect your emotional boundaries or your pronouns.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the logos. A is A.
Exactly. And Riker argues that if an engineering firm, pressured by BlackRock's capital starvation and terrified of disparate impact lawsuits, decides to prioritize the diverse demographic identities of its engineering team over the unforgiving, objective laws of physics, the bridge will eventually collapse.
People will die.
People will die in the physical world because the builders prioritize social fiction over natural law. You cannot negotiate with tensile strength.
Riker's terrifying conclusion is that when a civilization institutionalizes the prioritization of demographic checkboxes over demonstrable, rigorous competence, it is writing its own civilizational death sentence.
It is a stark apocalyptic warning about the physical consequences of ideological capture, and it forces the reader into a corner.
It really does.
Because if you accept Riker's timeline, if the language is corrupted, the logic is inverted, the legal courts are openly hostile, biology is denied by medicine, and the corporations and schools despise competence, what is the solution?
what is Riker's ultimate call to action for the listener? How does a man survive in a world he believes is actively trying to destroy him?
That brings us to the final and perhaps most radical section of the book. The spiritual warrior's endgame rebuilding parallel institutions. Because if you are expecting Riker to give you a get out the vote strategy, you're reading the wrong book.
Definitely the wrong book. Riker is absolutely fundamentally not advocating for political reform.
Why not?
Because Riker believes the rot is too deep. The system cannot be reformed from within because the foundational code has been rewritten. He is not telling his readers to vote harder or to protest or to write strongly worded letters to their senators.
So what is he advocating for?
He is advocating for a complete physical and spiritual exodus. He explicitly invokes what is known as the Benedict option.
Let's give the audience the historical context for that. Who was St. Benedict and what was his option?
St. Benedict of Nursia was a Christian monk who lived around 480 AD. He was a young man studying in Rome, and he looked around at the decaying, collapsing Roman Empire. The institutions were corrupt, the morals were degraded, and the barbarians were literally at the gates.
Rome was falling.
Rome was falling. And Benedict didn't run for the Senate to try and fix it. He felt a profound, divinely inspired disgust, packed his bags, and walked away.
Walked away to where?
He retreated to the wilderness of the mountains and began building parallel institutions, the early monasteries.
And those monasteries became the lifeboats of Western civilization.
Exactly. These strict, localized, heavily patriarchal monastic communities became the fortresses that preserved the hard drives of human knowledge through the centuries of the Dark Ages.
While Rome burned.
While the urban centers of the Roman Empire burned and descended into chaos, the monks in these walled communities preserved the agricultural science, the classical literature, the philosophy, and the theology. They kept the flame of the Logos alive in the dark.
And Riker's tactical command to the modern men in the manosphere is to replicate Benedict's strategy today. He preaches a gospel of extreme localism and subsidiarity.
He tells his readers they must fundamentally sever their psychological dependence on the mainstream culture. Stop seeking the approval of a society that, in his view, inherently hates you and wants to extract your resources.
He says you must actively refuse what he calls the corporate Eucharist of diversity training. Do not apologize for your competence. Do not confess to sins of implicit bias you haven't committed.
Right. Instead, he wants men to starve the federal beast by mastering their immediate physical geography. He uses the powerful metaphor of the hortus conclusus.
The enclosed garden.
Yes, the enclosed garden is a symbol of cultivated order surrounded by wilderness. Riker urges men to acquire tangible assets, buy land, start homesteading, learn to grow food.
And regarding families.
He commands fathers to pull their children out of the public school system entirely, viewing them as indoctrination camps, and instead create localized homeschooling cooperatives with other like-minded traditional families.
He even pushes for the creation of parallel, untrackable economies using cash, physical barter networks, and decentralized cryptocurrency, completely circumventing the corporate banking state.
But Riker is highly pragmatic. He recognizes that men cannot build these walled gardens alone, and more importantly, they cannot build them if they are physically, mentally, and spiritually soft.
Which leads to a fascinating, somewhat tragic section of the book where he laments the modern loss of male initiation rights.
Across almost all human history, and across tribal cultures, there was a specific mechanism for creating men. The elder males would physically separate the boys from the comfort of their mothers and initiate them into the harsh realities of manhood through controlled danger and hardship.
But Riker blames the weaponization of Title IX in the 1970s and the subsequent aggressive integration of the sexes for systematically defunding, outlawing, and destroying the male-only spaces where this vital psychological initiation occurred.
So because the state has outlawed the village elders from initiating the youth, Riker commands his readers to forge their own initiations. He calls them micro-ordeals.
Micro-ordeals? Like what?
These are intentional applications of physical suffering designed to build resilience. He orders men to subject themselves to 24 to 48-hour hard water fasts, to submerge themselves in freezing ice baths, to undergo aggressive, prolonged digital detoxes where they unplug from the dopamine drip of the internet.
It's all about asceticism.
Exactly. The goal of these ordeals is not physical health or wellness. It is to force the nervous system and the weak physical flesh to submit entirely to the rational will of the mind. In Riker's view, a man who cannot control his own impulses can never control his environment. It's about becoming physically and psychologically dangerous again so that you can actually be a protector.
This philosophy connects directly to his highly literal interpretation of a famous biblical passage, Ephesians 6, the armor of God.
For Riker, the Apostle Paul's exhortation to put on the full armor of God is not a cute Sunday school metaphor about being a nice person. He reads it as literal, tactical gear for spiritual warfare. The breastplate of righteousness is the adherence to objective natural law. But he focuses heavily on the final piece of the armor, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Riker interprets this through the lens of the Trivium. The sword is the weapon of precise, uncompromising language.
He brings up an incredible piece of theological history here to illustrate how that sword is swung. The story of Athanasius at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
It perfectly mirrors his lesson on grammar from the beginning of the book. At the Council of Nicaea, the early Christian church was fighting an existential ideological battle against the Arian heresy.
What did the Arians believe?
The Arians claimed that Jesus Christ was a created being, subordinate to God the Father. Athanasius, defending the Orthodox view, didn't try to seek a polite compromise to keep the peace in the church. He knew that compromising on the definition of God would destroy the faith.
So what did he do?
He wielded a single, highly precise Greek word, homoousios, which means of the exact same substance.
And the Arians wanted to use the word homoousios, meaning of a similar substance. It literally came down to one single letter, an iota.
Exactly, one letter of difference. But Athanasius held the line on that single letter, using the precise definition to completely crush the heresy and establish the Nicene Creed.
And Riker uses this historical moment to urge modern men to wield language with that exact same uncompromising, unyielding precision against the modern heresies of cultural Marxism. You do not concede a single inch of the dictionary.
Nodded.
Okay, let me pause and push back on this entire Benedict option premise, because I can hear the audience's skepticism right now.
Sure, lay it out.
Riker has to know that critics are going to look at this framework telling men to abandon society, take freezing ice baths, buy crypto, and go off the grid and call it delusional.
Oh, absolutely.
They'll say, it's just LRRPing, live action role playing. It sounds like guys playing dress-up survivalist in the woods, because they simply don't have the intellectual or social skills to succeed in the modern, diverse public square. How does Riker defend building a walled garden instead of staying and fighting for the culture? Isn't it just cowardly escapism?
Riker anticipates that exact criticism, and he addresses it by drawing a hard line between true escapism and strategic withdrawal.
How does he define the difference?
He argues that modern men are already engaging in escapism, but it's digital. Escapism is hiding in video games, consuming endless pornography, and living vicariously through digital simulations while your real life rots. That is cowardice.
But the garden isn't hiding.
No. He argues that acquiring physical land, mastering a difficult physical trade, growing your own food, and undertaking the immense, exhausting burden of raising and educating a traditional family outside the state's infrastructure is the exact opposite of hiding. It requires massive competence and courage.
He views it as preserving the seeds of the next Renaissance.
His philosophy is blunt. You cannot perform CPR on a rotting corpse. You can only bury it and plant a tree over the grave.
That is an incredibly heavy, fatalistic, yet strangely constructive framework. It's a lot to process. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's synthesize the architecture of what we've just explored.
The overarching journey of Riker's Trivium of God is remarkably systematic.
Right. It begins with grammar.
Yes. The realization that the dictionary has been hacked, and the mandate to reclaim the exact definitions of words so the adversary cannot manipulate your reality.
Then it moves to logic.
The embrace of the logos, demanding empirical truth and rejecting the unfalsifiable spectral claims and the envy-driven contradictions of modern ideology.
And proceeds to rhetoric.
Understanding the historical, real-world institutional capture of the courts, the schools, and the corporate boardrooms by the therapeutic tyranny.
And finally, it arrives at the endgame of action.
Accepting the futility of political reform, physically walking away from the collapsing system, and building parallel, patriarchal, localized communities grounded in natural law and rigorous competence.
It is a total ground-up rejection of the modern consensus, which leaves you, the listener, with an immense amount to chew on. Think back to the very beginning of this deep dive, to that disorienting feeling of the dictionary shifting under your feet, the sense that the rules of society had been rewritten in the dark.
Conrad Riker offers a highly detailed, historically grounded explanation for why that is happening.
and a radical, uncompromising solution for what a man must do to survive it. But I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to ponder on your own as you log off today. In our hyper-connected, relentlessly digital world, where every major legacy institution, corporate algorithm, and cultural megaphone seems desperately focused on pulling society toward a constantly shifting, digitized global consensus, is it possible that the most radical, rebellious, and dangerous act a person can commit today isn't organizing a protest, or writing a viral post, or fighting in the political arena, but simply mastering a physical trade, planting a garden, and raising a traditional family entirely off the grid?
It is a profoundly provocative thought drawn from a fiercely provocative book.
It absolutely is. And if you want to explore these highly charged arguments firsthand and dissect the framework for yourself, remember to check out Trivium of God, Deconstructing Marxist Lies for Spiritual Warriors by Conrad Reicher. You can find it right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And to dive even deeper into his ongoing theories and connect with his community, be sure to follow the author at Conrad Reicher on Substack.
Thank you for joining us as we forensically decoded this complex material.
It was a fascinating discussion.
And before you go, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to The Deep Dive. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these in-depth explorations into the most fascinating, challenging sources out there. Keep questioning the narrative, and we will see you next time.